Okay, this video is going to be about the layers of the heart. I already went ahead and wrote out a word bank, essentially, of what we're going to go over in this video and draw a quick little diagram so we know how these layers relate to each other. I really don't like, I've never been able to find a diagram that I feel does a good job of helping people understand these words and their relationship to each other. They're sometimes okay, but I prefer to just kind of draw it on my own. So I'm going to show you how I typically think of it. First, remember the very basic anatomy word dissection of endo, myo, epi. And endo is going to be something that's more towards the inside, within, right? Versus epi is going to be like towards the outside or above. And this prefix myo means muscle. So it's kind of like this little tissue sandwich. You have an inner layer, an outer layer, and you've got muscle or like the meaty part in the center. So think of it that way. And this is kind of the order that we're going to want to think about these layers as well. And I'll show you how that makes sense. So think about it like this. Here you have, I usually draw the hearts like this. Here you have the right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle like this. Essentially what we're going to do is we're going to imagine taking a chunk like this here. And we're going to kind of blow it up so we can look at all of these tissues there. So the nearest, the most inside layer, which I usually draw as kind of rugged like this, is going to be the endocardium. It's the most within. This is the layer, this is the tissue layer that's actually coming into contact with blood. So here, we'll give it kind of this red color. This is going to be the, oopsies, this is going to be the endocardium. Endocardium, okay? And then, so remember that this is more towards the inside, like this is the inside part of the heart, versus we're gonna work our way to go outside, okay? So just superficial to that, right, because we're working our way out, this is most inside or deep. Just outside of that, we're gonna draw a big, thick area here, like this. This is a really big, thick area because this is going to be the myocardium. And it's big and thick because muscle is really thick in this area as well. How about we do this? How about we make this like a really dark red, this endocardium? And then we're going to make the myocardium like a light, kind of more red, pinkish. Okay? So we're working our way out. This is towards the inside where blood is actually coming in contact with this layer, the endocardium, and then the myocardium is just outside of that. So we've talked about both of those so far. Then you have the epicardium, which you see I have a / here. This is synonymous. It's the same thing as the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. So here's where we kind of switch gears a little bit, is you have this endo and this myocardium, but then you also have the heart is sitting within this pericardium, which is this like hard, rigid sac that protects the heart in a way, but also kind of keeps it in its own little space. But it's not just one single lining. It has also multiple layers that we need to understand, right? So just outside of the myocardium, you have, and remember this is happening all over the heart. We're just looking at it in kind of a cake-like way because we're only looking at one section. Just outside of the myocardium, you have a layer that sits just next to it, which is going to be your epicardium. So let's draw that here. But you could also have labeled this the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. Now, the reason why is because the serous pericardium has two parts. The serous pericardium is one of the layers, but it has two parts. The visceral layer and a parietal layer. See how they're both of the serous pericardium? It has two parts. This is one of them. And it's the same thing as saying epicardium. So let's give this a color. Let's say the epicardium, which is the same thing as the visceral layer of the serous pericardium, sits just outside of the myocardium. like this. Okay, then, so let's check that off of our word bank over here. But before we get to the next layer, which is the parietal layer of the serous pericardium, there's actually this gap. So we're going to draw it out here. We're going to draw the next layer out here. This is that parietal layer, but there's this big space here. We'll talk about that in just a second after we label this. So this next layer, it doesn't sit just next to the epicardium and the visceral layer. This is the parietal layer. Of the serous pericardium. Because previously what we were learning is that the endocardium and then the myocardium was sitting right up next to it, and then you had the myocardium and then the epicardium was sitting right up next to it. But this is different. The epicardium, the visceral layer, does not sit right up next to this parietal layer. There's a space here. So let's give it a color. How about we do green? So here you have this parietal layer, the serous pericardium, but there's this gap. This is really important. This is known as the pericardial cavity. So this gap here. Right? This pericardial cavity is actually filled with fluid. What's the point of this? The point of this is because here, the endocardium, the myocardium, epicardium are going to be moving a lot, because every time the heart beats, it moves, it actually shifts. So in order to reduce friction, there is a space in the layers where fluid is, so it kind of has a gliding effect. So it's not constantly rubbing up against, it kind of has a gliding effect because this pericardial cavity is filled with fluid. So make that note. Pericardial cavity is filled with fluid, and why is that? Really big point here is to reduce friction during the heart contraction. Okay? So we just talked about the parietal layer of the serous pericardium, and we also talked about the pericardial cavity. Then we have one last layer, which is the fibrous pericardium, which sits just outside. Sits right here. So let's give that an orange color. Oops, and I forgot to label it. So the green is this parietal, and then here, this last one, the very most outside, the most superficial, here is going to be the fibrous. The fibrous pericardium, which we gave. So this is the way I like to think of it, and you could even go through and maybe draw some like blue squiggles, so that way you know fluid is here in this area. You could do that. You can barely see them, but this is the way that you want to think about it. So there's that last layer, okay? And that's it. Those are all the layers of the heart.